Many people who love gardening often wonder if they can turn their hobby into a commercial operation. Well, our friends Mark and Terry Silber have done just that. They now have a thriving business in flowers for drying.
They're sometimes called everlastings. Now, we've come over to get some advice on growing and using these plants.
Hi, Mark. Hi, Terry.
Oh, welcome to the garden.
Thank
Welcome
you.
here.
Good to see you.
Hi. Nice to see you.
Tell me something, Mark. What technically is an everlasting?
Barbara, an everlasting simply is a flower that will dry by hanging. As simple as that.
Well, I would love to start growing some. So could you give me some examples of the best ones?
Sure, there are lots and lots of kinds to grow, but why don't we start with the ones that we consider the most popular?
Great. Terry, you have an incredible variety of flowers here. But you know, it's interesting, you've devoted 2 entire rows to one species here. It must be a pretty special plant for you.
It is special. These are the globe amaranths, or Gomphrena globosa, and they really are one of our favorite garden flowers.
You know, I can tell just by feeling it that it must be a good plant for drying because it has that papery feeling to it.
Exactly, and traditional everlastings have very little moisture in their flowering parts, in their petals. The moisture is carried in the leaf and in the stem, and of course it makes the flowers ideal for drying.
It comes in so many colors, too, pink and white and...
Yes, and lovely deep cerise at the further end of the garden, the beautiful rich magenta. And this, which is a relatively new color to the Gomphrena category, is called Strawberry Fields, the bright red variety.
Oh, yes, I've seen it in catalogs.
That's right. Well, years ago, about 15 years ago, we had a visitor to our farm, a lovely and generous person from a garden in North Carolina. She had developed this color there, and she gave us seeds as a gift with the promise that we never make it available because it was so special. But now, of course, it's appeared in garden catalogs, and so it's available to everyone.
So everyone can grow it.
Exactly.
That's great.
Exactly.
You know, I think I would grow this plant even if it weren't good for drying because it has a great growth habit. It gets to about 2 feet tall, and the stems are nice and upright, and it has a bushy shape.
It's a lovely bedding plant, and in fact, if we grew none of these for drying, I'd still include it as a border flower. And our ancestors knew that. Jefferson included it in the borders at Monticello.
Did he really?
He did, in fact.
You know, I would say the same about this, too. This is our old friend blue salvia that lots of gardeners grow as an annual plant, but I don't think of it as a drying flower particularly.
That's right, and there's a lot of moisture if you feel the difference between this and the globe amaranth. But it dries just beautifully. This variety is the blue salvia, or the Salvia farinaceae, and this is Victoria. There's another variety that you probably know called Blue Better, which is a taller variety.
Right.
And the lovely thing about these is when you dry them, the red hue disappears and it gets even bluer than you see here.
Oh, isn't that wonderful?
It's excellent for drying.
Now, do you directly sow these in the ground in these rows?
We don't here, Barbara, because our climate, you know, is rather short, or the growing period is rather short, and so we start all the seeds inside in March for most of these annuals, transplant the annuals, and then set out the plants after danger of frost.
Well, what's this pretty little pink flower, Terry?
This we commonly refer to as acroclinium.
Oh, I think that's the Halictorum.
Halictorum roseum, that's right. That's the correct botanical name.
It's funny how these botanists can never agree, isn't it?
Well, they can agree, but learning the correct botanical names is really useful if you want to be sure of the plants you're getting.
It's the only way you really know.
Exactly.
It's a cute one.
And papery, the characteristic papery feeling in the plant.
How would you use this one?
While this is attractive in the field, I find that this is harder to design with because if you look at it carefully, it's very static and it's almost a perfect little flower, a little too perfect. So when we design with them, I tend to like to use these in groupings or clusters. It sort of relieves that stark look of the single petal.
Yeah, I can see that. Here's another nice little bushy, low-growing plant, Terry. Again, with those papery petals.
This annual, Barbara, is called Xeranthemum annuum, commonly referred to as immortals, and it's one of the oldest recorded everlastings.
Really? And this one is kind of all stem but very little flower, but what's there is very sweet.
And it's very useful too, because once this ammobium, or winged everlasting, is picked for drying, it retains that whiteness. That's not true of all everlastings. The whites sometimes diminish to a beige, but this is crisp and very lovely to work with.
Why is it winged? What does that mean?
Well, look at the characteristic shape of the stems. You can see that winging out.
The ridges,
The ridges, exactly.
That's fascinating. You know, I notice you have a lot of contrast here. This one is very simple and modest, but this plant, Terry, is the height of Victorian opulence and lushness and decadence. What's this?
It's a beautiful flower. This is Amaranthus cruentus, and it's related to grain amaranth.
That you eat.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. When you feel this, you realize that it's quite fleshy, full of moisture. And so in order to dry this successfully, it needs to be picked and put in a very warm place. We use our darkened greenhouses for drying this. And if you can do that, or over a register or a wood stove, you can retain this color and form.
So that's how you do it. What's the variety? Is that, do I look for something particular?
Yes, this variety I think is one of the most successful for everlastings, and it's called Prince's Feather.
I'm going to grow that one. Here's another really feathery one. This looks like just old-fashioned celosia.
That's exactly what it is, plume celosia or celosia plumosa. And you can see the wide variety of colors. Again, a very fleshy plant, so it needs to be dried quickly, but retains this color, and it's a lovely color and form to work with.
Terry, all the plants you've shown me are annuals. Do you only grow annuals for drying?
No, though the majority of the things we've just seen are annuals, and annuals provide you with the most intense and the strongest color. But you also need the more muted colors that are provided by some of the perennials, and we start harvesting some of our perennials as early as May.
Mark and I are over in a production area of the garden where he and Terry have a beautiful bed of Artemisia. Mark, I've noticed you planted this through black plastic, and it's certainly growing a beautiful Artemisia, but are there any disadvantages here?
With many single stem perennials, you can use black plastic year after year with good weed control. But with Artemisia, you have to take it off after 1 year, and then it gets weedy over a period of 2-3 years, and then you have to till it right back in.
Now, that's because the way Artemisia propagates itself, it won't come back up in this hole next year?
That's right. Next spring, there will be roots coming out every which way except through the holes where you want them to come out.
And so if you didn't take it off, it would smother your crop.
That's right.
Are these from transplants, or you said cuttings, right?
Cuttings. You know, Artemisia spreads by roots. And what you have to do is you take a shovelful of roots out, separate all the roots, looking for where it's sprouting, and put it in another place so you can start another bed.
And then it looks just like this the first year again?
The first year, looks again. We have to take the plastic up.
After that. Now that's Status. That isn't a perennial. How come that's over this way?
No, Status is an interesting plant. It's beautiful. It has a beautiful flower.
Absolutely lovely flower, yeah.
Also an essential element in the designer's palette. But as a plant itself, it's quite ungainly. There's a great deal of stubble. Though the flower itself is very pretty, as soon as it buds up, it's ready to be picked. And we can't put this in a display garden where there's just lots of greenery and stubble.
Now, the helichrysum here.
The flower of helichrysum is what we want. It's a very pretty flower, but then again, what are you left with? You're left with a bunch of stubble, and it's just green, and can't really use it for anything. There's nothing to display.
So this is the production area instead of the display area. That's great. No, I'm not familiar with this plant, Mark. Is this a perennial?
It is a perennial, and it's a hardy perennial, and it's one of those single-stem perennials that grows very well on plastic for year after year.
Sure, I can see that.
It is echinops, and it grows. Its name comes from Greek, echinos, meaning quills, and you can see it's very
Certainly
quilly.
is quilly, yeah.
Beautiful, steely gray, bulbous plant. It's a thistle kind of plant, and if you pick it right at this stage, before any of these quills open up, you will have a beautiful dry flower out of this.
And it holds the color well.
It will hold the color, and it won't shatter when you work with it.
Isn't that great? Now, I noticed something new here. This looks like an old piece of felt to keep weeds down in the path.
It is. It is a very heavy piece of felt, which we got from a local mill. It is a waste product after paper is made. And we're trying it this year for the first time.
Boy, it looks like it does the job well, but what would somebody do who didn't have access to waste products like this?
Well, in fact, there are other and perhaps even better ways for a home gardener to control weeds. All you need to do is have some newspaper and put a little bit of hay on top to hold it down, and you will have terrific weed control.
Now, you had another option over in the display garden. I liked that mulch.
Yes, we tried something new this year.
Now, Mark, this dwarf clover, which is both beautiful as well as practical, is what I call a living mulch.
Yes, it is. What it is actually white clover, which we plant between the rows after we laid the mulch down. And we what we do to keep it down in order for it to have air circulation, we just mow it with a regular lawnmower. The white Dutch clover puts nitrogen right back into the soil.
Because it's a legume.
That's right. And there could be no better way of fixing nitrogen and getting fertility to your garden.
Now, your crops are really insect-free, Mark.
And we do have a remarkably low incidence or low problem with insects. And we attribute it partially to crop rotation and partially to the fact that we have just so many different kinds of plants here and so many different kinds of flowers. They simply just get too confused. Where is that flower?
Variety is always good protection. Now, I'm a farmer, and I look at this. This looks like a field of red clover. If I were to cut this for hay, I'd just come through and mow it all down and let it dry in the sun. But I have a feeling it isn't that simple in the flower business.
Well, I wish it were. Unfortunately, with flowers, it works in a different way. There are rules for flowers, and you have to pick them just at the right time so that the color stays strong, so that the shape retains when you're trying to arrange them after they have dried.
Now, you have about 100 and more different flowers here. Does that mean there are 100 rules we have to learn?
No, you actually don't. There are only about 5 rules that we have distilled all this information to, and those rules are applied to all the flowers that we grow. And all you have to do is figure out which rule applies to what kind of flower.
So which category would this Gomphrena fit into?
Well, actually, Elliot, these globe amaranths are a perfect example of rule number 1. In that first category, you can pick these plants at any time during the season. If you're enjoying them as bedding plants, you can leave them there until right before frost, cutting down the entire plant. What happens is the earliest blossoms to be set develop into these large, long, elongated blooms, and the later ones are quite small. Now, in the middle of the summer, if you wanted globe amaranth, you don't need to shear the whole plant. You could simply come out, pick off a few blossoms, and dry them to work with, leaving the remainder of the plant there to enjoy.
And if you wanted smaller ones, you could cut them selectively for whatever decoration you're making.
Whatever size you want. So you really, in this case, have your flowers and your plant, too.
What a great operation.
Now, what's rule number 2?
Well, rule 2 concerns plants that open up after they are picked. And in fact, I have here a couple of helichrysums or helichrysums. Those I picked when we were in the field. And you have to pick it when the first 2 sets of petals are open. You take off the leaves and hang it upside down to dry. And as it dries, it draws the moisture out of the stem and the flower opens up. You're still trying to preserve that rosette and trying to keep the flower as large as possible. If it is picked a little bit too late, it opens up so the petals roll back, and then it becomes quite unattractive. And
A lot of people make that mistake because they pick it when the flower is prettiest.
yes, that is true, and it took us many years to figure that out.
Now, here's a good example of rule number 3, and that's the rule that includes plants that close just a very little bit after they're picked. This head, which is on the young side of mature, is just right for picking, because once we pick it, even if it closes a tiny bit, it will still preserve its color and its shape. All these buds on the outside, of course, will simply collapse into almost nothing, but this is what we're picking for.
Now, what if I picked an older one like that, Terry?
Right, and it's beautiful as a cut flower, but if we tried to dry this, Elliot, what would happen is it would shatter and it would lose its color. So that we really need to look for just the right stage, the early side of maturity.
Now, the timing on this is very exact. Any hints for helping people trying to hit it just right?
Absolutely. What we always say to people is listen to the rules and try to apply them, but test with a few flowers, because after 2 or 3 pickings, you're going to have time to evaluate the right time for picking a geranium or tansy or yarrows, because they're all included in this category.
That's great. Well, Barbara and Mark are out hunting for an example of rule number 4.
Okay, Mark, what is rule number 4?
Well, rule number 4 is none of the above. It's like a little SAT test. It's a plant, acroclinium, for instance, that has a life of its own. It's very interesting. When it is humid, it closes up. When it is sunny, it opens up. And, in fact, you can't pick it until it's sunny because it is closed up. Years after it dries, it looks like this if it is humid. And when it dries out, for instance, in the winter, it opens up just like this.
That's amazing.
Hi, Mark. Hi, Barbara.
Hi, Elliot. I think we're ready for rule number 5.
Okay, Terry, what is rule number 5?
Rule number 5 includes plants that have spiked flowers, like the blue salvias.
There are actually 2 parts to rule number 5. It concerns spikes that start from the bottom and spikes that start from the top. This is salvia, and the spike starts blooming from the bottom. In fact, you will encounter most spikes blooming from bottom up.
Oh, yeah.
When it is about 2/3 developed, it's ready to be picked. Just reach down and pick it. Now, there are some that are not quite ready. You see this? This one is not ready because when it gets this small, it will shrivel up and won't be significantly...
Would it hold its color if you cut it that small?
It will hold its color, but it will be a very small element. And you would need many more of these in order to make a significant statement.
Right.
Now, Terry has another spike. This is Liatris, and it blooms from top down.
You can see I picked this earlier because this is a perennial that came into bloom, about a month ago in our garden. This needs to be picked very early on so that your color remains at the top of the spike. It's an uncommon plant in that it blooms from the top down.
Right.
And you pick it only when the top is in bloom. I've just gone and picked this one that Elliot has in his hand, and you can see that it has color at the bottom, but rather an unattractive top.
So if you dried this one, you'd see the ugly part at the top. That certainly makes sense.
That's exactly right.
Terry, once I've cut all my blossoms and I'm ready, what's the next step in order to get them to dry?
Well, hanging and drying plants is quite easy. You come out in your garden, choose a plant, pick a certain number of stems. This is a large plant, so there probably aren't, 7 or 8 or 9 stems in here. Slip a string in between the stems, use an elastic, and really wrap that elastic fairly tight around here because as the stems lose their moisture, of course, they shrivel a bit, and you want them to be tight when they're dry. And tie your string together, and you've got a bunch to hang from the ceiling.
Oh, the elastic's a good trick, isn't it?
It's a good trick, which we learned, as with many other things, the hard way when we watched our things come tumbling down. It's also important to remember that when you pick bunches of flowers, you don't want that bunch to be so large that it doesn't dry quickly, because you can get some mold forming in here.
Well, now, where do you dry them, Terry? I've always heard that you need a dark place.
That's a bit of misinformation that seems to have been perpetuated in lots of the writing. The place does not need to be dark at all. It can have light so long as it's not sunlight falling on the flowers, because it's the UV rays or fluorescent rays that break down color. So a well-lighted room is fine so long as the sunlight's not falling on the plant. And in fact, you want the room to have lots of good air circulation, because that air flowing through...
So a dark attic would be terrible.
It would be awful, exactly.
So it's that simple.
It's quite simple.
You know, I'd like some inspiration also on how to display those. Will you show them to me?
Love to have you. Come into our design studio. We've got lots of interesting projects.
Great.
These are some of the projects I was talking about.
These are things you sell in your shop.
Right, or things that we make for our own household.
They're wonderful.
These arrangements in containers.
Isn't that nice?
These country hats. Would you like to try them?
Oh, sure.
That's great on you.
That's great. You know, it's nice to see some of the things that I've seen in the field, hard working in these bouquets. The helichrysum that was picked at just the right moment. And this blue salvia, you're right, it's even bluer when it's dry.
It's very blue. It's a real rich royal blue. And these wreaths, these are 2 examples of how different color schemes can be evolved. These very simple pastel, soft colors with the herbs and grasses, and these intense colors that created out of the globe amaranths and the helichrysum.
They stay so bright. I like the subtlety of these hydrangeas and pale zinnias. That's wonderful.
I do too. I think they're wonderful. And there's this little simple nosegay.
That's great. It looks to me as if these would take me a lot of time to do and quite a bit of expertise. Do you have something I could make on a busy day when I only have an hour?
Or less than an hour. In fact, it's one of the projects that we have started doing for ourselves, because it involves taking the bunches that you've dried down from the ceiling and arranging them quite casually in a container. We've got a half-bushel basket here, but often people have a basket or an extra piece of pottery that they'd like to work with. You've got your bunches here, like this, the purple statice that we saw, and you simply need to take the bunch, you don't need to do a thing to it, and arrange them by color in the basket.
What a simple idea.
In fact,
that's great.
Easy.
You know, I think the most ornamental thing of all, Terry, is just the way you've hung them on the ceiling of this room. It's so ornamental.
I think it's wonderful. I feel like we're living in an upside-down flower garden. We should do this in our living room.
We definitely should. So you really can bring the summer garden indoors for the winter.
Terry, Mark, thank you very much for sharing your garden with us and
Thank
with
you
our
for coming.
viewers. It's been a real pleasure.
Happy to have you here.
And thank you for joining us. For now, goodbye and good gardening.
If you want to learn more about flowers for drying, Mark and Terry Silber have written The Complete Book of Everlastings, published by Knopf. I highly recommend it.
Next on TLC, doing something for your home can be easy, even fun. Check and see here on Homebodies. Then, add value to your home with some serious improvements. The Home Pro shows you how.